Hello and welcome to an American Talk Show. I'm your host, David Allard. I'm an attorney from Fitchburg, Massachusetts. We have two guests with us today. We have Peter Sargent, and we have Hal Allard, going to be talking about a very controversial issue we have, which is debate between creation and evolution. And you can follow us on Kickstarters.com, which we'd appreciate you do. And also go to our talk show website, www.anamericantalkshow.com. You can watch our videos there, and you can also purchase from our website and contribute and see past videos. We will also be having a debate between Peter Sargent and Dr. Kent Hovind. And also both Hal and I will have questions for Peter and for Dr. Hovind. Hal, why don't you introduce yourselves?
Well, my name is Hal Allard. I'm from Phillipston, Massachusetts, and I'm a devoted Christian.
And Peter?
My name is Peter Sargent, and I'm from Gardner, Massachusetts, and I am the typical New England everyman.
Okay, thank you. Before we get into our conversation with Dr. Hovind, Peter, why don't you explain, now you're taking the evolutionist perspective. You
Right.
believe that the world was created through a process of evolution. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. The world, meaning the world of life, I think is what we're talking about here, because the world is physical, and that I don't think is affected by the laws of what they call evolution. The idea of evolution is that living creatures come into existence with some modifications over time. The earth and the geology and the physics that controls that is something entirely different. In both, the physical reality and the circumstances that any individual or planet find themselves in affect them over time. But in terms of living creatures, the idea that has come about that we call evolution is the idea that through certain circumstances, in the beginning electrochemical and organic compounds, and over time much more complicated life forms, and a variety of random and chance changes in species have led to a change over time. For instance, if you have a creature that is born with a marking system on the outside of it which causes its natural enemies, the predators which would prey upon it, to not see it, or to see it as something that they're frightened of, then that creature will have more time to propagate and to have more of its genetic material passed on down into perpetuity. On the other hand, if that creature does not have characteristics which give it survival value, that creature may indeed find itself gobbled up much more quickly. By the same token, when the Ice Age came to the North American continent as well as to Europe, there were many creatures that did not have the capacity to withstand the kind of environment that they had. Some of those were able to move. Many of them simply went out of existence because the weather changed around them and it became too cold. Those that could survive then had a greater ability to be dominant, and they passed on their genes and they passed on their progeny, and they became dominant species. I think one of the big things in evolution, you go back to where Captain Cook went around the world, and he came to the Galapagos Islands, and the Galapagos Islands really, I think, from what I remember in my history classes, made a huge impression on him, because you have a variety of islands which are very, very close to each other. They're volcanic islands, and yet you have dozens of species, very, very closely related, but distinctly different of, for instance, finches on these different islands. And he looked at that and he said, this is what happens when you have isolated groups growing up in the same environment with very, very similar kinds of dangers and very similar kinds of benefits for them. And they have the opportunity to develop, and they've actually developed into a huge variety of interesting looking species, all with survival value for their own areas, but all distinctly different. No reason for them to be so different, but the chance changes in their coloring, which happens over time, didn't detract from their survival value, and so they continued on like that. I read recently, I think it was that a two-headed frog was born. Just an odd thing that happens once in a while, and that's a very dramatic. I mean, we had a two-faced cat born in Worcester a couple years ago. I think it might even still be alive. If that has survival value in the wild, then that cat's going to pass on the genes which have the propensity for having two faces, or in the case of a frog, two heads. If it doesn't have survival value, and I think probably we can all agree that out in the wild, having two faces is not going to be a big help, or two heads, then it just dies by the wayside. So I think that's the basic idea behind the evolution theory.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, Peter, and I see you have a kind of a natural selection part of your argument.
Mm-hmm.
I'd ask you a couple questions. First of all, is it fair to say that even if you were to assume the world was created through a process of evolution,
You mean the world of animals and
the world
plants?
of the universe that we know?
Well, the universe is, I'm not talking about evolution in terms of the geological sense. What happens in the physics of chemistry and geology is not evolution.
Okay.
Evolution is something which occurs with living organisms.
Okay. Very good. All right. So, one problem with that theory is that there is a limited gene pool from which to draw. So, in other words, one argument could be made, well, you never see a dog become an elephant. And there are certain creatures which they're at the shallow end of their gene pool. They cannot. You can only use whatever genes you have. You can assemble them in any order you want,
Mm-hmm.
but you're going to never morph into a totally new species.
Right, like a two-headed frog is still a frog. It's
Right.
just its
Absolutely.
genes, or it nothing new. It didn't grow a wing, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
still a frog.
Mm-hmm. That's
So
right.
it's the same gene.
The other problem I have with that is that you have animals like a coelacanth, or sharks,
Mhm.
or alligators, who have, they're basically the same thing. The coelacanth's alive today off the coast of Madagascar.
Mhm.
It's the same coelacanth,
Mhm.
anatomically,
Mhm.
as the one existed 500 million years ago.
Mhm.
One of the oldest.
Right.
No evolution. But humans were purported to have evolved with Lucy, or basically from a chimp hominid
Mhm.
to what we are today
Right.
in only a couple million years.
I don't know that it's as short as a couple million years. I think it's more like 30 million years.
Well, Lucy's only 3 million years old.
And I think she represents a very advanced stage in the what they see as a chain of developments between something more like a lemur and the human beings we see today, along the way with ones who didn't make it.
They were
Most
mixed
notably,
bones. They were mixed bones.
mixed bones.
They were mixed bones they found in Lucy. Like the jaw was from an ape, and so the bones were significantly. They were found close together.
Mhm.
So the archaeologist he was paid to go get evidence. So he found
Wasn't
these.
that leaky?
Leaky,
Who
yeah.
found
Yeah.
Lucy?
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never heard that skeleton may not have been correct. I know that the Chinese, was it Peking man, was actually a hoax.
Right.
But if there was some incorrect bones mixed in with what they came to call Lucy, I mean, that's
But,
certainly entirely
but
possible.
even if that was the case, even if it was genuine,
Mhm.
I mean, I think what Leakey tried to say, well, part of it looks like a combination. It looks like it has part ape features and part modern day
Mhm.
features.
Mhm.
That it was like a combination of the two. But even so, Lucy was only 2 to 3 million years ago.
Right.
And how do we become from that in 3 million years when you don't see that kind of evolution with the coelacanth or the crocodile been along for hundreds of millions of
I think
years.
the idea of evolution is the dropping off or exclusion from the world of animals of those whose characteristics do not make them good survivors under the circumstances. And so the coelacanth that you're describing lives in an area of the world that didn't have the effect of the Ice Age that North America and Northern Europe had, and it obviously has survival skills that allow it to continue on without much variety. I don't think there's anything in evolution that says you have to morph from one thing to another. It simply says that those skills, those characteristics which provide for success, are the ones which cause the progeny, the gene pool, to carry on. And I think it's pointed out that some lifespans are very, very short. Really, they're just there to provide the genes to move on. You know, certain kinds of flies, certain kinds of mosquitoes, they come and they go in
So
an
it's
instant.
an adaptation argument that you're advancing. You're saying
I think
because
evolution
they
doesn't
could
say
adapt.
that they change to adapt. I think it says that these chance variables that appear among species, some of them have value to make them more survivable, and some don't. And under the circumstances, if survival is achieved, then those characteristics are carried on. And if survival is not achieved, well, that's why they have the Darwin Awards, isn't it?
Why don't these changes continually happen?
They do.
Why aren't we making new humans out of apes?
I don't know that the various primate families are not having mutants from time to time, some of which may have characteristics which carry on, most of which I would say have characteristics that cause it to not have survivability, because we're looking in a period of a couple hundred years at something which the idea of it is that it takes place over hundreds of thousands and millions
well,
of
that's
years.
it. You said it takes place over hundreds and thousands of years,
Mhm.
but where are any missing links? Like if I go in the jungle, if I take a plane down the jungle, based upon what you're saying, I should at least be able to find one ape with the characteristics that it's actually morphing into something different than an ape.
I think you could see it if you look at human beings. And I think you can also see it among primates. You have to look at all of them, and we know that in the natural world, those species are actually very, very stressed by overpopulation of human beings. The amazing and most notable predatory creature that's ever existed on the planet. But we have changes. We have changes that are going on all the time. And, you know, some people have better hearing, some people have bad hearing. What difference does that make? How about the thumbs? You know, 250 years from now, the thumbs really may be the dominant digit because of our development of communication and work devices. Those with good thumbs and maybe good hand-eye coordination will thrive, while those with other characteristics.
Well, if you
will not.
follow the Bible, we have the same thumbs today as Adam and Eve had back in the garden.
Mhm.
Now, you could argue that what you see there, Peter, is just a variety of a species.
Mhm.
How come you don't have completely new animals? Or do you?
Well, I think evolution doesn't say that brand new separate species spring from a certain animal. What evolution postulates is that there are various characteristics which occur in different animals, and some of them have survival qualities and some of them don't. I have two dogs. They are the same breed. How do they come to be a breed? Well, someone acting in the place of a deity has ordained that these two dogs are going to mate, not that one, and they go for a consistency of characteristics. And yet, one of those dogs is quite silent, and the other one is noisy. Now,
But it's still a dog.
and
No matter how many times you breed it, it's still a dog.
yes, absolutely. And in a wild, or no, let's even say in this circumstance, the noisy one, a breeder might say, yeah, we're not going to breed him because we don't want this breed to become a barking breed. And so we have unnatural selection. at work there. I mean, that's how we have come up with so many of the useful breeds of animals that we use today. I mean, the chicken today is not anything you would have seen in the Garden of Eden, for instance. It's something that was created to fulfill, and I said the chicken, I'm sorry, the chickens, because there are layers and there are meat chickens, right? And there's chickens that are simply there to put out eggs, and there are others that are grown for their breasts and thighs, and after a couple of months they're in plastic and
Well, let me take it back, because what you're talking about is evolution takes place only with organic creatures, living creatures.
Yeah.
And do you postulate that they came out of the ocean?
Well, if you look at what the geologic evidence is, at a certain point, the planet that we live on seems to have been almost entirely covered with water. And it is postulated that life came to be in water, going back to the movie that you may have seen when you were in grade school. I certainly saw it, called Hemo the Magnificent. Our blood is the salinity of the oceans at the time when life first formed. And the earliest single-cell animals utilized that liquid around them and inside them to move nutrients in and waste out. And later on, they formed clubs, groups. They became organisms, and they had that water flow through them, which eventually became a closed system, and it maintained that salinity of the early Earth oceans into the blood of all of us mammals today.
Well, I mean, God uses the same building blocks to construct, different creatures and whatnot. So when you see commonalities and things like that, it just means we have a common creator. It doesn't necessarily mean. But what you said that was interesting is you said that there was geological evidence. So which evidence were you pointing out there?
Geological evidence of the Earth having been covered mostly with water in the beginning.
Yeah.
It's my understanding, I'm not a geologist, but I took earth science in school, and I paid attention that around the world, if you look at geology, if you look at the layers that have been put down over years, or the expressions from molten Earth coming up through, and you look at how we know that the Earth is changing today, then you can see, for instance, in the mountains in New Hampshire, you can see ancient ocean life in the rocks. In fact, I have some at home, some shells that were taken from a rock where they were building a bridge up in the White Mountains. This was ocean floor at a certain point in time. It's been pushed up because of the physics of the Earth. But yeah, man, and I'm not a specialist. I know there's a lot to be said about that, and I can only speak from what I was taught. Let me say this about the religious concept. I grew up in an Episcopalian household. Some people say it's very Catholic. Some people say, oh no, that's very Protestant. Depends on which angle you take. My father was an Episcopal priest, and so, we had I think it's basically the American Bible. It's the King James. It has the Apocrypha, which was unchanged from the time when people first came from England, Scotland, Ireland to North America in English. And that was the text that we read out of.
So the Dewey Rames you're referring to?
The King James.
The King James.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now,
the Catholic version.
Well,
that's the one with the Apocrypha.
I think King James.
The New Catholic. King James.
Yeah.
The New King James is the one with the Apocrypha.
At the time that set of books was put together and called the Bible, or even any set of books long ago, going back to the Council of Nicaea, people did not understand so much about the world. They didn't know that germs exist. They didn't know how contagion occurs. They didn't know about the physics of what they were building. They knew so little. They knew some, They're prosecuting Galileo because he said, oh, no, no, we're not at the center of the universe. We're part of the part that's flying around the sun. It's not flying around us. They prosecuted him for that. We know today, unless you believe that all of our space trips have been staged in a Hollywood studio, we know today what orbit means. We know those laws of physics. We know how those things work. We know how far it is to distant stars. We know how to look for various things that people in the time of Galileo didn't have the facility or the technical knowledge to even wonder about. At any given time, it's what we don't know and what we can't make accurate predictions about that we must believe in order to have hope that there's someone out there who does and who orders things. And I think that that has so much to do with the stories that we have. I don't say that there's no truth in the Bible. The Bible is a set of books, stories, because there weren't books. The New Testament, I think, was very much laid down as books over time, but the Old Testament was stories. In fact, the Old Testament with its begats and begottens, that was to simply give authority to the Word.
Well,
You had to know it came from a place that had authority. Go ahead.
right. So you were saying about Galileo, how he was prosecuted. But likewise, there was thousands and thousands of Christians that were put to death and prosecuted. And at one point in England, it was even against the law to read the Bible. And that was punishable by death. So, on the other end of the bell curve.
As opposed to what?
As opposed to you're saying that, Galileo was prosecuted.
Right. No, I mean, I didn't know that it was against the law to read the Bible.
It was against the law to read the Bible.
Who persecuted people? The Romans?
Well, in England.
Right.
For
We're
years
talking
and
Roman
years.
times?
At Roman times, after
Okay.
Roman times.
Okay.
Up until 1611, up until King James said it was okay for people to start reading the Bible. You could be put to death. I can dig up lots and lots of research on the Bible and people being prosecuted and whatnot, but all the way up until 1611.
Was that during the Protestant Reformation? No, that was before the Protestant Reformation, right?
It was after, right? Yeah.
I'm not so sure about my history, but people find the amazing things to fight about and to desiccate one another over, and I don't know about it being illegal to read the Bible. I can certainly imagine a pre-Christian England, maybe even a Roman England, wanting to put down the subversive ideas that might threaten their governing authority. But then also there was a period of time where you could not get in your language.
Well, that was it. Like Martin Luther, so a lot of these people went underground to translate the Bible into, to German and into to English. So that was a big to do as well.
Right.
But what you were saying about the germs and whatnot, what's interesting is in the Bible you'll read a section in Leviticus where it actually explains the cleanness and unclean things, and that was thousands of years ago that certain thing was written. So
they made rules that worked. And if your rules said in order to be clean you had to boil water or wash your hands, I don't think they knew that washing your hands or boiling water killed microbes or removed microbes from things, but the effect of doing this certainly meant that they survived. Because if you didn't do it, you might very well die of diarrhea.
Just try to get me nailed down a little bit.
Okay.
Your contention would be that somehow there was a big ball, the earth we live on, that was covered with water, and from that creatures evolved and came on land, and they've been evolving through a process of natural selection and whatever random event would happen.
And along comes man.
Along comes man. It's just one of those animals.
Right, but I mean, along comes man and takes over, and so natural selection is going by the wayside. I mean, there's a lot still happening in the natural world, but much of what we see today is unnatural selection done by human beings.
But you take the evolution from that point on, and anything prior, what do you attribute the origin of the universe to? Do you believe that is...
Universe or life?
Universe.
Well, you know, I'm not a physicist, but I think there's a couple of theories being talked about, and one of them is the Big Bang theory, and I think that has it, that because of an accumulation of some sort of matter, you know, and it's the chicken and the egg question. I don't know, and I don't know that anyone does know, and there's a lot of things that we can't know yet, but there's a lot of things we know today that people 100 years ago, or probably even 50 years ago, couldn't imagine the question, and we've already got the answer. Okay? We can, with a telescope, tell how far something is by the light that we see, and we look at the spectrum, and that tells us whether it's moving away from us or toward us. And you know, there's an awful lot, and they've been able to test those things, triangulate, coordinate, and see that it's true, just as you can be driving down Route 2 and see the spire of St. something or other's, Cecilia's, in the middle of Leominster, and it changes in relation to where you are as you go along. That doesn't mean it's moving.
Right. But what I'm getting at is, even if you believed in the Big Bang Theory, if you do a retrograde analysis and go back to the Big Bang Theory, it really doesn't help you in any way. Because now you're down to a singularity, but you still have an energy that you don't know where it came from.
Yeah, and you know, I'm not even all that curious. I hope that.
But doesn't it come down? Doesn't it come down to faith at that point? The ultimate that there was some energy that came from somewhere.
Whatever you don't know, it's very comforting to come up with consensus as to what it probably was, and I think that when cold, hungry human sits there wondering if they're going to eat the next day with its group of people in Northern Europe, or a frightened, hot human with its group of people in the jungles of Central America or Africa, we comfort ourselves with a belief that there's something out there that can make it okay. Now again, I'm not even curious really about how all that started.
It's beyond that, because
we are where we are today.
Our brains work in a logic pattern. Our logic pattern says you never can get something from nothing. Never. It can't happen.
I'm not saying that
that
God doesn't exist.
That counters logic in terms of how this universe came to be. So the creationists would say, well, natural events were sprung, and you had these chain reactions, and things happen. Okay? But the evolutionists would say that things happen through random events and natural selection. Okay? But what do they say happens first? That we all came from dust? What does the evolutionists say? How do they explain to the public where we came from? Now, this is important to me because when in the school systems, they teach evolution. They don't teach creation. And they teach it as science. But yet it all comes down to a faith ultimately when you do the retrograde analysis. Because you bring it back to a singularity, you can say, well, yeah, that's all we know. We can only go back as far as a singularity. But no matter how far you go back, you've got to create something from nothing. Unless you believe there was something, a prime mover or something that already existed, whether it's cosmic dust or something. Our mind says, God, you can't get something from nothing. You got to have something. So that counters logic. Our being here counters logic.
Yes. An amazing thing that we are here.
So a creationist says, well, there's a God, and He created it. And an evolutionist say, well, it happened naturally from organisms, our molecules that turned into organisms. But in reality, we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about a faith that either a divine entity with design created it, or a random act. So when I see the arguments of Kent Hovind, and he says, well, if you look at your watch, how complicated your watch is, I can say there's got to be a designer for that. It didn't happen by random events. You could say, well, maybe it did happen by random events, but the probability is against it. So when Hovind looks at the world, he says, it's too complicated to be random events. Evolutionists could say, well, it could very well have happened randomly. But have you gained anything with either theory? I mean, if you're a creationist, you say, well...
I'll tell you what you gain.
What do you gain?
If I'm going to work hard and produce something, I want to have the security of knowing that my time and my life have not been wasted at that point. And so what I want when I obtain a home is to know that it was constructed in a way that's going to last and it's worth what I pay for it. What I want when I get an automobile is to know that it was constructed well, that it's safe, and that it's going to provide me with good, reliable transportation for a period of time that makes it worth what I pay for it. These things don't happen by chance. They happen by our design, and that's perfectly fine. I can measure things, and I can make predictions based upon those measurements, and I can test whether or not those predictions are correct in the long run. And I'm talking about all different human endeavors. So what science has done for us is it has created a variety of ways of looking at the world based upon having an idea this might be happening, testing that idea, and replicating the test. So it's not just something that happens one time.
You can be a Christian and
absolutely
and a creationist and believe
absolutely. Well,
but science and evolution aren't equatable.
I don't.
Just because you're a scientist doesn't mean you have to believe in evolution.
No. And
as the origin of the world.
And you know, I sit here today. I'm not curious about how all of this started. I know that if you think enough about it and you need to know certain information for making projections into the future, you want to know that. My brain's not big enough to handle those questions. I want to live to be, a few years older and maybe even have some time off in my life and enjoy some things that I haven't been able to. That's my goal in all this.
Aren't you at least a bit curious as to where you will be going when you die?
No, I'm not. And in terms of a deity or deities, I know that we have this very fine collection of literature that works for a segment of the world's population, but it is only a segment of the world's population. There are many, many different, equally valid religious ideas, creation theories, wonderful stories about how all this came to be, and some really awful ones too. It may be that, well, first of all, let's assume, from my little being here, that there is a deity. Can I name it? Can I describe it? I mean, I can hear between 20 hertz and 2,000 hertz, more or less. There's stuff going on all around me that I can't hear. Does that affect me right now? No. So, do I need to think about it? No. So, that's the way I see it. Now, I can go to the museum in Boston and I can look at a painting by Van Gogh, and I can see his fingerprint in the paint. He's been dead a long time, and yet I can see the actual physical impression he made upon the world, in addition to his mental impression. And I look at this world, the world that we live in and that we can perceive, is the fingerprints, the handprints of God. Even if God is just the laws of physics.
That's a very good point, Peter. And I'd like to thank both of you guys for coming tonight. And I'd like to have another episode where we can delve a little bit more deeply into this. And we'll take up this issue again. Thanks for coming, and that's a wrap for tonight.